Francine, you got introduced to this lake. What year was your first trip up?
1984, actually.
Whoa.
Yeah, because I was a grad student at the University of Toronto, and my master's advisor was the guy who initially discovered with his grad student, discovered Indian corn pollen, what they used to call Indian corn, which made them recognize that there probably were Indigenous people living near here. And so they then communicated with people at the Archaeological Survey in London, Ontario, who then came out to do an excavation and found evidence of the longhouses. And so no one ever knew this. At the time, there was still a farmhouse up on the hill where the longhouses are now. So anyway, so he had been coming here for decades. And when I was his student, he took a field trip here. So that's the first time I was introduced to the lake.
Did you think it was as significant then as you do now?
No, because I thought it was super cool and significant because at that time they had already reconstructed some of the longhouses that are in the village right now. And so it was really interesting to see the evidence of from the pollen, the corn pollen, and the other pollen of the cultivars, the crops that the people were growing, that there were people living here in the middle of the last millennium, like from 1268 to 1486. There was a whole village of Indigenous people living their lives up there. And so that's cool, and the fact that you could see in the sediment record that happened was interesting. And particularly what was interesting was the fact that the reason I'm able to tell you that it was between 1268 and 1486 is that the deep basin of Crawford Lake, like tree, has annual layers. So like tree rings, so it has annual layers. So we can count back to see where the corn and the other pollen of the crops that they were growing, and they start showing up in 1268 and they stop showing up in 1486. So that was cool. But that's not nearly as cool as we found out recently.
Recently being when?
So in 2018, my colleague who works down the hall from me was at that time the chair of the subcommission on the Quaternary period, which is the period of time in which we live, the geologic period. And their group had recently agreed to take ownership of the term Anthropocene. There's a very specific way that you need to do that. The method requires that there be a place on the planet with a geologic record that preserves something significant that marks the beginning of that time.
Right.
So the question was, what place on the earth were we going to use and what time? They finally argued back and forth, and they decided to use the middle of the 20th century as the beginning of the Anthropocene, because the vast majority of them bought the argument that the one thing we can all agree on that is man-made, that happened, we know exactly the first time that it happened, it had never happened before, is the detonation of the atomic bomb.
Right.
And then once they had agreed that the record of the atomic bomb was what they were going to use, then exactly what about the atomic bomb were they going to use? And they've decided on plutonium. So it's an element that is very, very rare other than in atomic bombs. And when it goes up into the upper atmosphere in a big, mushroom cloud, it gets carried in the atmosphere all around the world and it falls out. So it's called nuclear fallout. So the fallout accumulates wherever it lands.
Worldwide.
Including in Crawford Lake. So the idea then is you need a geologic record that preserves this plutonium that you can find the exact year that you're looking at, so that you can find the middle of the 20th century. And because Crawford Lake has annual layers, all you have to do is count back to the middle of the 20th century. The Crawford Lake has a really clear sedimentary record that marks every year, so it's ideal.
So you talked about your research. So you come out here and do research. What is it that you do? How does it go? What's the point, and how do you
Right.
do it?
So we are doing a number of different things. The most significant thing that we mostly do from the ice surface, because it's really hard to do otherwise,
Oh,
is take the freeze cores. So we take a sampler that's filled with a slurry of dry ice and ethanol, and so it's a hollow tube. It's got 3 faces, and we drop it into the sediment. We leave it there for 15-20 minutes, pull it up. It's frozen a rind of the lake around it, right? So it's actually frozen because you drop this really cold piece of metal into the sediment and it freezes. So you bring it up and you've got these beautiful annually layered sediments, and we bring those sediments to the lab and you can analyze those for whatever you like. We go in the deepest part of the lake, which is about 24 meters, but the sediment you need about 60-70 centimeters to capture. You need that much to capture the Anthropocene and the time leading up to it. In fact, in that much you capture the Iroquoian village too. Like
wow.
That much you would capture, because every year you have this much sediment accumulating. They're little tiny varves. So, yeah.
Oh, I see. I had a picture in my mind of you sort of continually digging deeper, and that it being a really deep chunk that you had to, you know, if you want to go back to the 50s, you had to go even deeper. And
yeah.
So this is, what you're describing to me sounds very fragile. It's not a big space.
It's that much. Well, yeah, so it's about that much freeze core, that thick a rind on a piece of metal, and then we bring it back frozen to the lab. But
and that covers how much of a time period? Like
1,000 years.
That much covers 1,000 years.
That much covers about.
That blows my mind.
Yeah. When we put the monitor down just for kicks while we were doing the freeze coring in 2018, and we found that, contrary to popular belief, the bottom waters are not anoxic. They're well oxygenated. We were weirded out because in most lakes that have well oxygenated bottom waters, there are bottom dwelling organisms like little clams and worms that churn up the sediment. So these knife sharp annual layers are only in the bottom of the lake because there are no large organisms churning them up. So that's why the explanation was because there's no oxygen, because most meromictic lakes are anoxic at the bottom. That's why no large organisms are churning them up. But there's plenty of oxygen.
For how long?
50 years. But there's plenty of oxygen. So the answer turns out that it's not because of the oxygen. It's because the waters are quite much more saline than the surface waters are. And there's this big density contrast at about 15 to 16 meters down the water column, so that the upper 15 meters or so are a normal lake, and below 15 meters it's basically a big well of groundwater. And so the water at the bottom of the very deepest part of Crawford Lake, below 15 meters, is not water that we can see here that's sourced from rain. It is water that has flown from the edge of the escarpment and oozed out into the bottom of the lake. And now we've worked out the hydrology. We've worked out the characteristics of the water that make it a varved meromictic lake that has oxygenated bottom water. And that is virtually unique on the planet.
Wow.
Meromictic lakes that don't mix all the way to the bottom are rare. Meromictic lakes with oxygenated bottom waters are unheard of. This little lake might be the place where humans begin to actually recognize the overwhelming impact that we've had on all aspects of the planet.